It is wonderful to be meeting together at another one of our webinars. And this one, I think that we approach with mixed feelings, because the topic is beware and prepare, and it has to do with the realization that the outcome of the Knesset elections in Israel will impact issues that are dear and important to all of us, namely the challenge of Jewish peoplehood, Jewish unity, relationship between Israel and world Jewry, and of course Israel itself as a Jewish and democratic state, and its ability to live up to some of the values of the core principles that to many of us, if not to all of us, are associated with Israel's core identity as a Jewish and democratic state. As usual, our co-sponsors are Hiddush, the Rabbis and Cantors for Religious Freedom and Equality in Israel, and we have Rabbi Neil Gold as member of our executive committee, and probably more. I think that I saw more of our members of the executive committee here, but there are more of us than I see in one screen. And J-Plan, the Jewish Pluralism Legal Action Network, and I saw that Peter Buxbaum, co-chair, and probably others are here with us, and the American Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists, its past president, Steve Greenwald, and who is now continuing his leadership role and overseeing its international work, is with us, and Steve has been a wonderful partner in so many ways. And to discuss the topic with us is Rabbi Gilad Kariv, MK, attorney, and a good friend. He credits me with being his mentor. I think that's a bit exaggerated. He has really paved a glorious, impressive path for himself. Indeed, he did follow the path of combining rabbinic interests with legal interests. And indeed, for a number of years, he was the deputy director of IRAC, of the Israel Religious Action Center. But what he is most known by is the years that he headed the reform movement in Israel, the IMPJ, actually changing its name from Progressive Judaism to Reform Judaism. But that's for another webinar. The branding issues and the perception of Reform Judaism in Israel, the changing perception of Reform Judaism in Israel. And after a very successful term as head of the Israel movement, he has succeeded in being elected to the list of candidates in what we call in Hebrew makom reali, realistic slot, namely a viable slot, and as unfortunately only a small list was able to make it into the Knesset, Gilad was in it, and he excelled as chair of the Law and Constitution Committee. And I'm saying that not just because I like Gilad, but because I've witnessed him in action, and I've followed him very closely. And he has done a lot to promote the dialogue in Israel regarding religious pluralism, religious freedom, beyond where it was before he came into his position. We will not be talking much about labor today. We are trying to focus on the issues that that combine religion, state, and law, which are areas in which Rabbi Gilad Kariv is really an expert. So I'll we'll start with him. Afterwards, I will pick it up and talk about some specifics. We'll see how much time is left for us. But the first question that I want to ask you, Gilad, assuming that everybody here on this call knows the results, and some are probably more concerned than others. Just yesterday, I think the Jerusalem Post reported President Isaac Herzog's introduction or welcoming message to the Hebrew Union College as he dedicated the Toby entrance plaza, in which he said, possibly no need for the anxiety the diaspora Jews are expressing. Well, it's a good thing that he does not share in the anxiety. Are you anxious about what's coming? And can you tell us, if we take away the natural political concerns, frustration, etc., what specifically do you think we need to prepare for and beware of in the area of religious freedom, democracy, and pluralism?
So, shalom, good afternoon, dear friends. First, let me thank my mentor and Rabbi, I insist, our friend Rabbi Regev, for inviting me to this to take part in this webinar. I see many familiar faces and names of good friends, colleagues, and partners, and I want to thank you for joining this important discussion, and of course, to acknowledge the crucial and important role that Hiddush is playing in Israel in this fundamental arena of religion and state, a role that will become even more crucial in the coming few months and maybe a few years. You started, Uri, by saying that we are gathered with mixed feelings. I need to be much more direct, and I want to say that many of us in Israel, including myself, we feel distress, and we hold a deep concern in regard to the future of Israeli politics, including in this specific arena of religion and state. And before I'll share with you what I see as direct and even immediate threats, and I need to say that I do not agree with my good friend, President Herzog in that regard. I want to remind us all, and I agree with Uri, I assume all of you know the results of the national elections. Still, I want to remind us all that we face today two political situations that we didn't face many times in the past. The first situation is that probably the next Israeli government is going to be a right-wing, ultra-Orthodox, ultra-nationalist government without any presence of a central political player or a political player from the Israeli center. And when you look into the political history of Israel, you need to embrace the fact that in the past, since 1977, when Menachem Begin took over, we experienced only few years under such a political situation or circumstances. We experienced it between 81 to 84 with the second Begin's government. Those were the busiest years of religious legislation in the Israeli history. And we experienced it between 90 to 92 with the third government of Prime Minister Shamir. Since then, during all the terms of Netanyahu as a prime minister, there was always a more moderate political force part of the coalition that balanced in many ways the desires of the ultra-Orthodox parties. And we don't have it probably today. The second political reality we need to identify is the tragic collapse of the Israeli Zionist left. And here I want to say that our, how to call it, democratic bloc, in Hebrew, in Israel, we called it Gush HaShinui, the bloc of change, in the last few years. But the more central left-wing bloc made a long series of political mistakes towards the last election, including my party and all the other parties. The fact that Meretz, that for almost 2 generations played a very important role in promoting the values of freedom of religion and religious pluralism, disappeared from the Israeli political, national political arena, is only a symbol to the failure of our bloc. And not only we are going to witness probably a strong and homogenic right-wing ultra-Orthodox government, I cannot say that it will last for 4 years, probably not, but still they are starting from a strong and homogenic majority. Not only we are going to face this government, the Israeli opposition is weak, is divided into too many parties and political forces, and the need to reorganize the camp is more clear than ever. Now, after sharing this general concerning analysis, I think that we need to say in a very clear way that there are few direct and immediate threats to our past achievements and to some of the, how to say, battles or some of the victories we had in recent years. It includes our achievements in the arena of conversion, the recognition of the State of Israel in non-Orthodox conversions. It is too early to say if the threat is only on non-Orthodox conversions in Israel or it also includes the diaspora. It definitely presents threats to our ability to promote the work of the non-Orthodox movements, and some threats in regard to the strength and the authorities of the rabbinical establishment and the rabbinical courts. And here I must say that I assume that in the coming few months, we will find ourselves in a new circle of conversion legislation. And in that regard, those are real threats. Again, I think President Herzog is misidentifying those threats, and we need to be fully alerted in that regard. To those direct threats, we need to add another major threat, and this is the attempt of the next government to weaken the constitutional and administrative authorities of the Israeli Supreme Court. And here we need to say again, we know the importance of our political efforts. We know that in the end, you can't win it all inside the court chambers. But at the same time, we all know that because of the political structure in Israel and because of the constant need to run after the ultra-Orthodox parties in order to gain a majority, we know that many of the achievements that we did achieve in the last few decades in this important arena of religion and state, and we had many, many achievements. Uri's name is on many of those achievements. Most of them at least started with a Supreme Court ruling. And almost by definition, the attempts to weaken the strength, the constitutional authority of the Supreme Court comes from the desire of the ultra-Orthodox and ultra-nationalist forces to push the Supreme Court back, especially in the field of religion and state. And if they succeed, it will clearly not diminish, but it will lower dramatically our ability to address the court in an efficient manner and to bring the Israeli Supreme Court to balance this huge gap that exists in Israel between the views of the general public and the majority in the Knesset in this area of religion and state. So besides the direct threats to our achievements in the arena of conversion, in pushing back a little bit the rabbinical courts, in promoting the status of the non-Orthodox communities, this effort to minimize the ability of the Supreme Court to draw a red line will dramatically, I think, make it more difficult for us to fight for our cause in the future. Now, I do think that we are not going to witness a new wave of new religious legislation. It's not that suddenly bad legislation that we succeeded to block in the 80s and in the 90s in regard to Shabbat, in regard to rights of the LGBTQ community. I don't think that we are going to see at the beginning a massive wave of new religious legislation as we saw it in the beginning of the 80s with the second Begin government. But it is enough to block the ability of the Supreme Court to play a productive role in this arena, and it is enough to push back our achievements in the arena of conversion, maybe around the Kotel, some other things, in order to change dramatically the atmosphere, but mainly our ability to push slowly more and more achievements. There is a threat, and it has to do with the growing understanding of the ultra-Orthodox parties that the Israeli public doesn't like religious legislation. There is a real threat that the real impact of this right-wing ultra-Orthodox government will be seen once again in a massive shift of national resources towards those specific sectors. And there I want to suggest an analysis. I don't know if Uri joins me in this analysis. I tend to believe that the ultra-Orthodox politicians know today that they will pay a price if they will go wild with religious legislation, and they will be careful, but they will not stop themselves from being wild in this shift of resources and public efforts towards their sectors. And when you know the numbers of the Israeli job market, when you look into the numbers of how many young students you have today in the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox schools, when you analyze the damage to the Israeli economy that is created from this deficit in the percentage of Haredi men, ultra-Orthodox men in the job market, you understand that there is a real, I must say, existential threat to the Israeli economy if in the coming few years we'll see a government policy that will actually shift the resources towards the Haredi sector in a way that will block and stop some natural processes that we see in recent years inside this community. A slowly growing rate of participation in the job market, a growing desire of some Orthodox communities, ultra-Orthodox community, to include elements of core curriculum into their schools. We are going to see an immediate block, I think, in those processes. And from my perspective, this is a real concern.
Another question. There's another question that I wanted to raise with you, but two things before. One is Gilad will be leaving us after a short question and answer period, and then I will continue for a little while. So if you want to ask Gilad questions, write them in the chat, and I'll present them to him. And the other is, I will be remiss. I didn't, as I said, we have quite a number of participants in this webinar, and I didn't see them all. But one I cannot overlook. And even though his ego is non-existent, and he has been a silent supporter and builder and pillar for many, many years since he and I started Hiddush. I do want to mention Stanley Gold, our Hiddush chair, and a tremendous supporter for everything that's progressive, liberal, both in the States and in Israel, and a great partner to have. I see that Mark Enshen, who's also a co-chair of J-Plan, is on the call, and probably a few more that I've not picked up yet. So the question to you, Gilad, is, so our participants today, some of them are from Israel, but many are from mostly North America, the US and Canada, but beyond. What role do you believe they can play or should play in meeting this challenge? Obviously, they don't vote, but do they have a role to play in reversing the tide, at least with regard to religious freedom and pluralism?
So, Uri, thank you for this important question. It is also a good opportunity for me to say shalom to Stanley and to thank him all for all he's doing for Hiddush and for our general cause, and to all the other again partners, friends, and colleagues, rabbis, lay leaders, cantors. Look, we are always being asked what is the role of a diaspora Jewry in our important battle, and we have our ordinary answers. And I want to tell all of you, and I said it a week ago to the Board of Governors of the Hebrew Union College that came to Israel to celebrate the ordination and the dedication of a new part of the campus in Jerusalem. I want to tell you really that we are now in a situation that the awareness and involvement of diaspora Jewry, mainly North American Jewry, is extremely critical. And when I need to analyze what are the main players that can help us push back those new threats, progressive, liberal, you'll give the right title, but we know what we are talking about. Small p progressive world Jewry is by definition, because of the political weakness of the liberal camp in Israel, is a major player. And here I want to say, not only in regard to block some of the direct threats in regard to the conversion, the law of return, the kotel, the status of the non-Orthodox communities, but also in regard to the status of the Israeli Supreme Court. And here I'm asking you, and I'm sure that in that regard, Uri fully agrees with me, we are not talking about two separated issues, religion and state, and the constitutional authority of the Israeli Supreme Court. Those two issues are deeply connected, and the main motivation of the next government to push back the Supreme Court has to do with religion and state, and not with the criminal procedures that Netanyahu is facing. And on those two issues, the voice of the Jewish community in North America is extremely important. This voice should be presented in a public manner, and we know, you know how to do it, we did it in the past. It should be also presented to Netanyahu and his team through back channels. And world Jewry and Jewish leaders should whisper on Netanyahu's ear and on Herzog's ears that it's not only the issue of law of return, it's also the status, the constitutional status of the Israeli Supreme Court. And in that regard, I need to say, I'm not an expert for American politics and the ties between the Jewish community and the American politics, but I do want to say that I think that the results of the midterm elections in the US make it more easy for North American Jewry to present a strong stand on those issues. It's important to say it. I think that when you analyze the presence of Jewish legislators in DC, of Jewish political players, the results of midterm election make it more, how to say, accessible for Jewish organizations, Jewish politicians, Jewish communities to send the message in many different ways. This is one thing. The second thing I want to say, and again, it's not a new message, but it is much more relevant today. We will have to work extremely hard to reorganize our progressive Zionist camp in Israel. I think that the clear results of last elections will push us to be more serious in reshaping the camp, and to do it also through placing issues of religion and state in the core agenda of our new political structures. Lieberman, the leader of the Israeli Russian speakers, moved from the deep right to the center of Israel's political map only around issues of religion and state. and is today part of the moderate bloc only because of the issues of religion and state. There are few opportunities here that we will have to work extremely hard in order to meet. Yet, we need to remember that we are starting from a very weak situation of the Israeli opposition, and it increases dramatically the importance of the Israeli civil society. I want to emphasize it. Hiddush, the Israeli Religious Action Center, other players in this important arena. For years, we were the civic satellites of Israeli politicians and Israeli parties that placed the issue of religious freedom and religious pluralism as part of their core agenda. Today, the leading players, because of the election results, are the civil society organizations. And here I want to say in a very strong way that we really need to see or to find a way to strengthen the Israeli civil society that is working on those issues. And I'm not afraid today, I'm not the CEO of an Israeli NGO, I'm a politician, so I allow myself to be even more direct. Yes, the Israeli civil society needs to cultivate Israeli philanthropy, and we are doing it, but the battle is not only for the sake of Israelis, it is also for the sake of world Jewry, and in that regard, it must be a combined effort. And we are talking about resources, but we are talking also about public support, endorsement. We are talking about making sure that Israelis know that figures like Rabbi Uri Regev, like many other figures that we have, I'm mentioning Uri because he is really one of the pioneers here and the heroes of our long-term battle. They need to know that when Uri Regev is talking about religious freedom, he is doing it also on behalf of many, many Jews in North America and other parts of the world. And there are different ways to show it. There are different ways to reflect it. If once again, whenever an Israeli Council General or an Israeli ambassador or an Israeli official is visiting your congregations, and once again, 95% of the questions are about the Iranian deal and not about religious pluralism, we are not doing our work in a faithful way. World Jewry will not impact Israel's policy on the Iranian nuclear threat. I can assure you that. Today as a politician, I can assure you that. World Jewry can dramatically impact the Israeli policy on issues of religion and state and constitutional status of the Israeli Supreme Court. So I'm almost begging you, and I know that I'm talking to people that by definition are deeply involved. I'm almost begging you not only to maintain your involvement in the coming months and years, but to increase it and to make sure that you convey the message to your audiences that this is once again a critical time for all of us that understand the importance of the relations between Israel and world Jewry and know that the democratic nature of Israel is critical in order to keep those relations alive.
Thank you, Gilad. I hope everyone has been listening to your explicit and implicit messages. Steve Fleischer, and I want to take this opportunity and thank Steve. He's one of the key supporters of our legal advocacy work, which, as you pointed out, is so important. So Steve Fleischer is asking, do you see any hope that Netanyahu's coalition will be unable to agree on the distribution of ministries, leaving room for a realignment and the entry of more centrist forces, blocs, into the coalition as a moderating influence against the most extreme of the right-wing parties. So before I turn it to you to respond to, I want to share with our participants that there have been a number of surveys done after the elections, and there is, as there was prior to the elections, a majority of the Jewish population that supports the notion of a unity government which will either exclude the Haredi parties or neutralize them. And the interesting thing is that Yesh Atid, the largest party in the current opposition, in the new opposition, about 50% of their voters have expressed support for the notion of Yesh Atid, or Yesh Atid and the National Unity Bloc entering into the coalition. And there is a tension here. So with that, there have been a number of questions that you were asked, and we probably won't be able to get to them, but I'll share them with you so that maybe we'll be able to answer in writing, or at least make some reference to the issues that were raised.
I'm looking at the question.
So is one way of changing the situation for the better, not far from perfect, but for the better in the area that we are discussing, by sort of coming down from the high horse and saying, okay, we'll do that which we said we won't do?
So I'll say the following. Look, I fully agree, of course, with Uri's description of public views right now. We also the surveys. Yet I need to say that in the near future, I don't think this is an extremely realistic option. You know, always politics is a field of surprises, but to believe that the next government will be formed on the basis of the Likud, ultra-Orthodox parties, and the ultra-nationalist Tzionut Datit party. I believe that we might face in the future situations that will bring Netanyahu to rethink the structure of his coalition. I tend to believe that if we face a security crisis vis-a-vis the Palestinians, vis-a-vis Hezbollah, a growing tension in Temple Mount, then we might see a new structure of the coalition, but I don't think it will be an immediate development. And it brings me back to the importance of our ability to stop dramatic moves. And I think that in the next few months, we will have to fight back. And maybe then we'll see some political developments. Here, I think, again, that the American politics play an extremely important role. The fact that the Biden administration ended the midterm elections not as a lame duck. And again, I'm not a real expert, but I think that we all share this understanding, makes it more difficult to Israel and to the Israeli government to go to the extreme. And I do believe that in back channels, in the next few months, maybe a year, there will be an American pressure to bring into the coalition a more moderate player. And it also goes back to this concept of what we need now is to focus our energy and, to keep the walls up, with the understanding that maybe in few months or a year or 18 months, there will be a decrease of this political pressure in Israel, because the coalition will reshape itself with an American pressure or without an American pressure. I do think that while we experience a political partisan weakness, as I presented in length, in the last few years, we saw a new wave and a new energy of civil protest in our larger camp. And we saw tens of thousands of Israelis fully dedicating themselves into protest against Netanyahu. It had mainly to do with his criminal charges, but we start to see today again a shift of this political energy towards the battle over democracy, the battle over the authorities of Supreme Court, the battle against a new wave of religious legislation, or this shift of resources. If we play it wisely, we might be for the first time in a situation that there is a massive civil protest in Israel, which is also connected to issues of religion and state and constitutional related matters. By definition, we need to wait and to see the new government, the distribution of ministries, the coalition agreements. So I don't think that we can today start this battle. We definitely need the leaders of the North American Jewish community to signal to Jerusalem and to Netanyahu that it might be a serious match if he crossed the red lines. I can share with you that we spoke with leaders of not only the non-Orthodox streams, but leaders of the Jewish North America federations in North America, AIPAC, AJC. I'm sure that many of you have channels to local leadership and to national leadership of those organizations. This is definitely the time to start and to send signals of alert to the Israeli government. Once we know the concrete threats, we'll have a short time to organize our global Jewish protest against those issues. And I want to remind us all that we knew how to do it in the past. We succeeded to block many attempts to change the conversion legislation in Israel and to reverse Supreme Court rulings. And I think we know how to do it, and we'll have to assemble our collective energy again. I see a question in regard to AIPAC. I know that today, following the midterm, there is a lot of domestic Jewish discourse around the work of AIPAC, but I do want to say that in the past, in critical moments, AIPAC was not vocal, but was efficient in sending quiet and strong messages to Netanyahu in a very personal and direct way. And I think that if we face a threat in regard to issues like conversion and Supreme Court constitutional authorities, we must use all of our tools, organizational and political tools, regardless to domestic legitimate discussions inside the Jewish community in the States. When it comes to issues of religion and state, we need to assemble all the players that we can identify in order to send loud messages and quiet and efficient messages to Netanyahu's office. And I want to say AIPAC did it in the past, the federations did it, AJC did it, Jewish legislators, both in the Senate and in the House, did it. And we'll have to repeat what we did in the past.
Well, you have Both provided us with light, not at the end of the tunnel, but even earlier than the end of the tunnel, and some practical suggestions, and I think a very insightful analysis. I mentioned before, you have been a model parliamentarian, and your work is going to be ever more important, even when you are not part of the ruling coalition.
I'm the only man in the Zionist left. I was left, the last man in the Zionist left. So, yeah.
So you will probably have to borrow from Avis's commercials. We try harder. So as hard as you worked before, you'll have to work harder. We are very grateful to you. I promised Gilad and his assistant that we'll let him go earlier than we are. So thank you. Until the next time, we'll certainly benefit from your wisdom and knowledge. And I hope that you'll be available to join us after a few months in revisiting this.
Always.
Thank you, and we'll continue for just a few minutes with some of the follow-up to what Gilad was saying and some additional insights. Let me share the screen. Okay, one moment. All right, so we know what the results of the elections have been. I don't want to go over it again, but I think for those who are not aware of it, of the coalition of 64, the emerging coalition of 64 out of the 120 Knesset members, 50% are, for the most part, ultra-Orthodox. 50% are religious, most of them ultra-Orthodox. Namely, between Smotrich and Ben Gvir's party to the ultra-Orthodox Shas and United Torah Judaism party, you have 32 Knesset members, and of course there are some that are very close to them in terms of religious identity and fundamentalist religious identity among the Likud members, Knesset members themselves. So this is a government that will have a majority of ultra-Orthodox fundamentalist orientation. Now, one thing that is very important to stress is, where are the Israelis on all of that? And when I say Israelis, I'm specifically looking at the adult Jewish population, because the results of the elections are clear. The makeup of the next coalition, until what Steve Fleischer was asking about and what Gilad was assessing may happen down the line. So people did vote for the Likud and its allies, and provided it with a narrow margin, but nevertheless a majority, 64 out of the 120. So the question is, where are they on those issues? So just a couple days ago, an important commentator, reporter on Channel 12 TV reported on the doubling of the allocations to the ultra-Orthodox yeshiva students. And what she was saying is, Netanyahu is leaving an impossible legacy for our children's generation. As of today, the loss of GDP from this policy is 29 billion shekels. Within 10 years, we may reach a total loss of 80 billion shekels. This will require a direct increase in taxes on everyone who works in the state of Israel. So 2 points should be made. One is, yes, we talk about the issue of financial subsidies to the yeshiva students as in the area of religion and state, preferential treatment of yeshiva students, preferential treatment of the ultra-Orthodox. But the hard economic reality is much larger than that. And some time ago, we had Professor Dan Ben David, a leading Israeli economist, speak about these very issues, namely the clash of religion and state. How does it adversely impact Israeli economy and the future and the viability of Israeli economy. So what we are seeing is that when people emphasize that this will be an additional $1.25 billion or $1.5 billion shekels to the budget of the yeshivas, that's really the tip of the iceberg. The real damage is that this will then impact directly on fewer ultra-Orthodox yeshiva students going into the workforce, which already causes a hemorrhage in Israeli economy because they are not playing a constructive, participatory, contributory role in the Israeli market, productive market, as they should based on their size within Israeli economy. And let's remember, whereas an average ultra-Orthodox family has 6.5 children, a non-ultra-Orthodox Jewish family has 2.1 children. So the Central Bureau of Statistics estimates that this issue, this challenge, is going to multiply itself. And by the year 2065, 32% of Israeli population will be ultra-Orthodox. Now, these are projections, that may not be the actual number, etc., but it just gives you the magnitude of the economic challenge that's associated. And her reference to increase in taxes, actually a few years ago, the governor of the Bank of Israel has already spoken about it openly, saying that and he was focusing primarily on the lack of willingness on the part of the ultra-Orthodox community to teach co-curricular studies to their boys, to their sons. The girls do study co-curricular studies, as was explained by the leader of Agudat Israel a few years ago. At the time, it was Rabbi Litzman, who says men should work? Isn't it enough that women work? Well, no, it isn't enough. And the fact that they don't study co-curricular studies means that they are unable to enter into an active participation and partnership in the workforce, even when they want to, or if they want to. And the governor of the Bank of Israel estimated that would lead the fact that they do not and cannot enter into the workforce in a meaningful way representative of their size and capacity, will result with a 16% increase in the taxes that the non-Haredi population will have to pay. So that is a major, major issue that will have to be taken up much more forcefully, audibly, visibly than it has before. And if you want to know where the Jewish population is on that, our 2022 Israel Religion and State Index, in which we asked many of those questions, is very clear. Whereas only 31% feel that the funding for the yeshivas should be maintained or even increased, 31%. 69% of the adult Jewish population say cut it out, or at least reduce it in a very significant way. And that includes Likud voters. As you can see, only 35% of Likud voters are saying keep the subsidies to the yeshivas or even increase them. But 65% of Likud voters are saying cut it out, stop it, or at least reduce it drastically. So another thing that I don't think that Gilad mentioned, but is going to explode very soon, because in 3 months, the draft law as it currently exists and sanctions mass exemptions of yeshiva students from military service. And again, this is not a pluralism issue. This is a core issue, a gut issue for so many Israelis, that they have to serve, they have to put their lives at risk, and they serve for years in reserve duty, whereas the yeshiva world, and the number was more mentioned, there are currently about 140,000 yeshiva students in Israel. 140,000, of course, not serving in the army and receiving funding from state coffers, which will now be doubled in all likelihood. So in 3 months, the Supreme Court ruling that said this is unconstitutional, this cannot be maintained because it undermines the core principle of equality. And therefore, the Supreme Court invalidated and it allowed the Knesset and the government to work out an alternative law that would be in keeping with these basic principles, and first and foremost, a much greater level of equality than the mass exemption that is currently the case. And already one of the leading Knesset members of the Likud, a former whip of the coalition, MK Miki Zohar, spoke, and one of the things he said is, as far as he's concerned, whoever wants to spend 3 years and study Torah from morning to evening should be congratulated for that. And when he spoke in a radio interview, a news program, a very popular news program, when the interviewer asked him, but what about equality? He said, I don't think there is a problem of equality. So already they are laying the ground for legislation that would attempt to legitimize continued mass dodging of the draft. And what do Israelis think about it? Well, Israelis hate it. And whereas only 25% feel that the notion of Torato Omnuto, for the yeshiva students, the Torah is their vocation. And to further infuriate the general public in Israel, they speak about Memitim et atzmam be'ohala shel Torah. They put themselves to death in the tent of the Torah, and further compare the dedication and the sort of self-sacrifice that the yeshiva students are making to the soldiers and the IDF. And of course, people are responding, well, when you go to memorial services at the Israeli military cemeteries, all you see are non-yeshiva students. No, this is not an argument that carries favor with the average Israeli. So only 25% support it, and 75% are saying either they should all be drafted like everybody else, or are saying what actually Hiddush is saying, and this we wrote about it in the past, and this is what we suggested. Let there be a certain quota, generous quota, but small quota. We suggested 10% of the annual cohorts that should be selected on objective grounds, that would select only the excelling students, the objectively excelling students, and like excelling students in other areas, should be granted exemption from military service and an even more generous subsidy, but the rest should be either drafted to the army, and the decision should be the army's decision. They should draft those that are conducive to the needs of the army, and the others should be performing civil service. So again, clearly the majority of Israelis, including the majority of Likud voters, a large majority of Likud voters, are opposed to the notion of letting the Haredi yeshiva students off the hook and telling them, that's fine, you carry on studying the Torah, we will defend the country. And the same is true with regard to core curriculum. Now the debate, as you know, has been waged for a number of years in New York. Until recently, new criteria has been adopted that the Haredi schools in the state of New York are supposed to be abiding by. Same story in Israel, except in Israel, politically, those schools are receiving funding, generous funding, even though they don't teach core curriculum, especially not to the boys, to the boys' schools. And one of the promises before the elections by the next prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, in all likelihood, has been to add 3 billion shekels in order to increase the funding of schools that don't teach core curriculum. Well, for the general public, that is unacceptable, objectionable, and basically repulsive. 23% only say that parents should be allowed to choose education without core curricular studies, and the state should fund it. The majority, 77%, and most of them are saying they should be required to teach like any other school that's state-funded, and the 14% are saying 50% should be cut. All right, the one thing that I also want to suggest to you before we call it a day or an evening and say farewell until the next time, I want to relate to something that Gilad was saying. When we and others are looking at how do Israelis define themselves politically, you look at that breakdown and you realize this is not what Israel was characterized or identified by in the first decades of the history of the state. But this is now, and there is no telling what the future will bring, but this is not going to change overnight. The reality is that only 14% of the adult Jewish population in Israel identifies itself as being left of center, with 67% identifying themselves as being right of center. You cannot understand the outcome. This wasn't just the failure of the liberal bloc or the labor or the social oriented, or however you want to call it. This is a shift in the makeup of the psyche of the average Israeli Jew. Now, why is it? Variety of reasons, and I'm no expert, but we need to be sensitive to the fact that this is where Israelis are politically. And when I say politically, left and right, I'm referring to, for most Israelis, this isn't about economic philosophies. There is very little that distinguishes most of the Israeli political parties in terms of economic philosophies. This is about the peace process, this is about security, this is about settlements. And the reason, I believe, a key reason why so many Israelis choose to identify themselves as being on the right of center is they are afraid. They're afraid, they see terror, they see increasing terror, and they feel the answer should be a strong hand, a strong leader, harsh security measures. How does one change that? Will that change? To what extent can we enter into a dialogue in which liberal Jews outside Israel who feel that is the wrong path to take will understand that it's Israelis that have skin in the game. It's Israeli lives that are at stake. And we need to be much more sensitive to that fact in sharing views of opposing approach to peace and war. So it may change, but it won't change because somehow labor or Meretz, if it is able to resurrect itself, will do a better job of explaining their ideology. It will take a lot more than that to change. But on the other hand, and this is, I think, one of the things that Gilad was alluding to. On the other hand, when you look at the breakdown of religious identity, what you see is that 65% of adult Israeli Jews identify themselves as either secular, most of them, or traditional, not religious. And that explains why, for most Israeli Jews, the notion of freedom of religion and conscience is desirable. 81% support freedom of religion and conscience in Israel. Now, I'm asked often by American friends, American Jewish friends, what about separation of religion and state? Well, that's a less attractive proposition for Israelis because separation of religion and state sounds to many Israelis as if we are talking about separating Judaism from the state of Israel. And that's not where most Israelis are. They want Israel to be a Jewish state, except they want a Jewish state which is Jewish and democratic, which celebrates religious freedom, which celebrates pluralism. And while freedom of religion and conscience on the one hand, and separation of religion and state, bottom line, are quite compatible and quite, in many areas they are one and the same, still as a label, Chofesh Dat v'Shivyon, or Chofesh Dat u'Matzpun, which is the language taken from the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel, is what most adult Israeli Jews support. Now, of course, they vary. Secular, 96% support it. Traditional, not religious, 85% support it. Even ultra-Orthodox support it as a concept because they feel that their rights are not sufficiently acknowledged. Okay, the last thing that I want to share with you is the question that was, the question that was asked, the question that was asked at the end, namely, how do Israelis feel about Jewish diaspora intervention in matters of religion and state? And the truth of the matter is, as many of you know, that when you ask Israelis about it, about diaspora intervention in these matters, Israelis are ambivalent, if not hostile. But this refers primarily to diaspora telling Israel where the borders should be and what security safe measures they should adopt, and what kind of threats they should be tolerating. But when you ask about supporting religious freedom and equality, when you are specific about freedom of marriage, about doing away with the monopoly of the chief rabbinate, when you're talking about gender equality, etc., what you see is that some 2/3 of the adult Jewish population are saying, bring it on. By all means, get involved, do support. And for those among you and your friends and your colleagues, and quite a number of the people who participated are active in federations and are supporting these federations and others financially, etc., you should realize this is something actually Israelis are eager to see you doing, supportive of, and looking forward to collaborate with you in advancing. Many Israeli Jews feel that the political game, the fix is in, and we need diaspora Jewry to strengthen our hand and join us in fighting it out so as to bring Israel to its founding promise, that of freedom of religion and equality. All right, I don't know that there were any questions addressed to me, but as I said to Gilad, we'll try and look at the questions. I see the clock, it's already 12 minutes past the hour. I don't want to abuse your patience. I thank you for your participation. I thank you for your patience and interest. Do write me, uri@hiddush.org. If you have additional questions, suggestions, we really would welcome your input. And we'll send the questions that weren't answered by Gilad to him, and I will look at what you may have asked or will be asking me, and will be glad to share the responses with you. I will be sending you the PowerPoint presentation, and you'll see lots more than I've spoken about. And the article, the op-ed that appeared in the Jerusalem Post today about an issue that we cannot over-exaggerate its importance. Gilad spoke about it, I spoke about it. We had a special session with Professor Susie Navot dedicated to the threat to the rule of law in Israel, to the independence of the Supreme Court. This is an issue that goes to the heart of Israelis' democratic character and to everything that we care about. Stanley, do you want to say a word before we part? Unmute yourself.
Thank you, Larry. No, I thought this was a very good session and one that we need to keep on for a long time. This is an ongoing problem that isn't going to get solved with one Zoom or even one election, I fear, and we need to double our efforts.
Thank you, Stanley. I think that I made the analogy, and with that we'll end. I made the analogy, there may be a partial analogy here to the midterm elections in the States. I was rather surprised to hear that it's a matter of, routine, that with midterm elections, the party whose representative sits in the White House loses seats. And there is obviously a reason for that. I believe that the triumphalism, which is demonstrated by the Haredi parties now, will ultimately come back to bite them. Israelis hate it, and if we are going to be successful in translating that is made possible not because the Haredi demand it, but because the partners accede to their demands. And therefore, those who are responsible for subjecting the Israeli public to such excess, coercion, lack of equality, lack of pluralism, undermining core democratic principles, should be paying the price. So I think that the worse it is in the coming time, and we should put up as much fight as we can, but we should not lose sight of the fact that this is like a wheel, and it turns around and changes. It has changed in the past, and it may change in the future, and those who make excessive demands on Israel may end up seeing that this is but a boomerang effect. All right. Thank you all for being with us. We'll be together again soon, monitoring the situation. And thank you, JPlan, the Jewish Pluralism Legal Action Network. Thank you, our wonderful supporters in the American Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists, and the Hiddush rabbis and Kenters for Religious Freedom and Equality. I'm delighted that there were so many colleagues and Federation activists on this call. So until the next time, shalom and להתראות.